The black SUV screamed around the corner of Gangnam's financial district as tires shredded against wet asphalt as three more cars closed in from behind, headlights slicing through the rain like blades. Inside the lead vehicle, Kim Tae-Min gripped the door handle, his knuckles pale, his breath steady despite the chaos outside. Gunfire cracked against the reinforced windows. His driver swerved hard, narrowly avoiding a delivery truck, and Tae-Min's bodyguard in the front seat barked orders into a radio, screaming for backup that was still 4 minutes away. "They found the new route," the bodyguard shouted over the engine's roar. Someone talked. Tae-Min said nothing. He simply stared out the window as bullets pierced the night, his mind eerily calm, the way it always became when death circled close. And in that strange, suspended moment between chaos and clarity, his thoughts drifted, not to the empire he had built, not to the billions sitting in his accounts, not even to the men trying to kill him, but to a memory that had never left him in 20 years. A memory of rain, of hunger, of a small hand reaching out to a dying boy nobody else in the world had bothered to save. Before we go further into this story, if you're someone who believes love can survive 20 years of silence, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe, because this story is about to take you somewhere you won't forget. 20 years ago, in a narrow alley behind a noodle shop in Incheon, South Korea, a 13-year-old boy named Tae-Min lay curled against a concrete wall, his thin frame trembling under a punishing autumn rain. His lip was split. His ribs ached from the beating the shop owner's men had given him after catching him stealing a single loaf of bread. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. His mother was gone, taken by sickness the winter before, and his father had vanished into gambling debts and cheap soju long before that. There was no one, no home, no name that mattered to anyone. He didn't cry. He had learned crying did nothing. He simply lay there, waiting for the cold to finish what the men had started. That was when he heard footsteps, small, quick, hesitant, splashing through the puddles. A little girl stood over him, an umbrella far too big for her body tilted against the wind. She couldn't have been older than 9, with dark skin glistening from the rain, twin puffs of hair tucked beneath a yellow raincoat, and eyes wide with a fear that wasn't for herself. "Hey," she whispered, crouching down despite the storm soaking her shoes. "Hey, are you okay?" Tae-Min blinked at her, confused. He didn't understand English well, but her tone needed no translation. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. "Don't talk," she said, shaking her head firmly, as if she was the adult and he was the child. "Just breathe. I'm going to help you, okay? I promise." Her name was Sharon, Sharon Blakemore, daughter of an American logistics contractor stationed in Korea for his company, living with her Aunt Delphine while her parents worked long overseas contracts. She had wandered from the family's convenience store just around the corner, searching for her lost cat, and instead found a half-dead Korean boy curled in the rain like he was nothing more than trash the storm forgot to wash away. She did not think about the risk. She did not think about her aunt's temper, or the store rules, or the fact that she was a foreign child in a country where she barely spoke the language. She only thought about the way his eyes looked like her older brother's the time he had pneumonia and almost didn't make it. She grabbed his arm, ignored his weak protest, and half-dragged, half-guided him through the back alley, behind crates of soda bottles, into the small storage room behind her aunt's shop. "Stay here," she whispered, pressing a folded blanket into his hands. "I'll bring food. Don't die on me, okay? That's an order." For the first time in weeks, Tae-Min almost smiled. Over the next 2 days, Sharon snuck him rice balls, leftover kimchi, half a sandwich she claimed she wasn't hungry for, and a stolen juice box from the store's cooler. She taught him a few English words. He taught her how to say thank you in Korean, gomawo, and she practiced it every time she handed him food, giggling at her mispronunciation, while he corrected her patiently, his voice growing stronger each day. "You talk too much," he told her once in broken English, smiling despite himself. "You almost died 2 days ago," she shot back, hands on her hips. "I can talk as much as I want." They were an unlikely pair, a starving Korean boy and a fearless American girl, but in that tiny storage room filled with cardboard boxes and the smell of instant noodles, something rare took root: trust, loyalty, the kind of bond formed only in desperation, the kind that doesn't need years to become permanent. But 2 days was all fate allowed them. On the third morning, Sharon's Aunt Delphine walked into the storage room, searching for extra soap stock, and found Tae-Min sitting against the wall, blanket wrapped around his shoulders, a half-eaten rice ball in his lap. She screamed. "Sharon Renee Blakemore? What in the world is this?" Her voice cracked through the store like thunder. "You brought a stranger, a Korean street boy, into my house? Do you have any idea what could have happened to you?" "He was dying, Aunt Delphine. I couldn't just leave him there." "That is not your responsibility. We are guests in this country. Do you understand what could happen to your father's contract if people find out we're harboring some runaway?" Delphine grabbed Tae-Min by the collar, hauling him up despite his weakened state, and pulled him toward the back door. "Out, now, before I call the police." "No, please, he didn't do anything wrong. He was just hungry." "Sharon, enough." Tae-Min, still weak, still trembling, looked back at Sharon one final time as Delphine shoved him into the rain-soaked alley. Their eyes locked, hers filled with tears, his filled with something he didn't yet have words for: gratitude, grief, a silent vow. "I'll find you," he said, in the clearest English he could manage. "I promise, I'll find you, Sharon." "Wait!" she screamed, running after him, even as her aunt's grip locked around her wrist. But by the time Delphine's grip loosened enough for Sharon to slip free, the alley was empty. Rain had washed away his footprints. She ran 3 blocks in every direction, calling his name, except she realized, with a horror that would haunt her for decades, that she never actually knew his real name. She had called him hey and you the entire time. She didn't even know what to call the boy she had risked everything to save. She never saw him again, not the next day, not the day after. Her family relocated back to the United States 4 months later when her father's contract ended, and Sharon carried that rainy alley with her for the rest of her life, wondering, always wondering, if the boy she saved had survived. What she didn't know was that Tae-Min had survived. Barely. He wandered for days after being thrown out, sleeping in stairwells, eating from trash bins, until an old street vendor took pity on him and introduced him to a local gang leader who ran protection rackets around the docks. It wasn't kindness that saved Tae-Min the second time. It was necessity. The gang needed sharp, hungry, desperate boys, and Tae-Min was exactly that. He rose through that world with terrifying speed. By 16, he was running numbers for the organization. By 20, he had eliminated 2 rivals who underestimated his intelligence. By 25, he had absorbed 3 smaller syndicates into his control and rebranded the entire operation under legitimate-looking shipping and investment companies, laundering an empire that stretched from Busan to Seoul to international ports across Asia. By 33, Kim Tae-Min was one of the most feared and respected men in South Korea. Publicly, a billionaire investor and shipping magnate. Privately, the shadow boss of an organization so deeply embedded in the country's economy that even government officials owed him favors. But no amount of money, no empire, no fear he commanded ever silenced the memory of a 9-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat who saved his life and asked for nothing in return. Now, back in the present, gunfire still echoed through the streets of Gangnam. The SUV skidded into an underground parking garage, security teams flooding in from every direction, neutralizing the last of the attackers within 90 seconds. Tae-Min stepped out of the vehicle, his tailored suit unwrinkled despite the chaos, his expression unreadable. "Sir, are you hurt?" His head of security, a stocky man named Dae-Sung, asked breathlessly. "I'm fine," Tae-Min said flatly. Then, after a pause, he added, "Find out who ordered this, and when you do, don't kill them immediately. I want answers first." Dae-Sung nodded and turned to relay orders, but Tae-Min remained still for a long moment, staring at his own reflection in the rain-streaked window of the garage. 20 years of clawing his way from the gutter to the top of an empire, and still, every time death brushed against him, his mind went to the same place. That alley, that rain, that girl. "Find her," he said quietly. Dae-sung turned. Sir? The investigator I hired 3 years ago. I want a status update tomorrow morning and bring in 2 more agencies. I don't care what it costs. Sir, with respect, we've spent almost $4 million over the last 3 years searching for an American woman named Sharon, with no last name, no photograph, and no confirmed location. The trail went cold in Ohio 18 months ago. Then widen the search, Tae-Min said, his voice sharp enough to end the conversation. Money is not the issue, time is. If you're feeling the tension building right now, that's exactly what this story's meant to do. So make sure you're subscribed and your notifications are on, because the moment these 2 finally cross paths again is coming, and you do not want to miss it. Half a world away, in a glass-walled office overlooking downtown Atlanta, a woman named Sharon Blakemore sat across from her executive board, calmly dismantling a hostile takeover attempt against her real estate and logistics conglomerate with the same fearless composure she'd carried since childhood. She was 32 now, sharp-eyed, elegant, a self-made businesswoman who had built Blakemore Holdings from a small property management firm inherited from her father into a 9-figure empire spanning residential development, freight logistics, and international trade partnerships. Ms. Blakemore, one of the board members said cautiously, Harrington Group is offering 40% above market value. Shareholders are going to push hard for this. Then let them push, Sharon said, closing her folder with a decisive snap. I didn't spend 12 years building this company just to hand it to a group of vultures because they waved money at scared shareholders. We counter, we hold our ground, and if they want to fight, they'll get one they won't recover from. The room fell into murmurs of admiration and hesitation, but no one argued further. Sharon Blakemore did not lose fights. She hadn't lost one since she was 9 years old, standing in a rain-soaked alley, refusing to let a dying boy give up. She still thought about him, more than anyone in her life knew. On quiet nights, staring out over the city skyline from her penthouse, she would sometimes trace the outline of a small scar on her palm, an old cut from broken glass she'd gotten while sneaking food to him all those years ago, and wonder if he was even alive. She had hired 2 private investigators over the years, quietly, without telling her family, but with only a first name and vague memories of Incheon, both had eventually returned empty-handed. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Monique, knocked twice before entering. Ms. Blakemore, the Korean delegation from Kim Global Holdings is confirmed for next month's trade summit. They want to discuss the shipping partnership expansion into the southeastern ports. Sharon's brow lifted slightly. Kim Global Holdings? I thought we were still finalizing terms with their regional office. Apparently, the CEO himself insisted on flying out personally this time, something about wanting to meet the partners directly before signing anything of this scale. Sharon shrugged, unaware that the name attached to that company, the very same name her heart had quietly searched for across 2 decades, belonged to the boy she had once wrapped in a stolen blanket in the back of a Korean convenience store. Neither of them knew. Not yet. The weeks leading up to the summit were filled with escalating tension on both sides of the ocean. In Seoul, Tae-Min's rivals, sensing his recent assassination attempt as a sign of weakness, began circling like sharks smelling blood. A rival organization led by a ruthless man named Park Jun-ho began quietly buying loyalty from smaller gang leaders within Tae-Min's network, whispering that perhaps it was time for new leadership. Tae-Min, ever calculating, allowed the rumors to spread just enough to expose the traitors, methodically cutting them from his organization one by one, each removal more brutal than the last, cementing fear back into the hearts of those who dared doubt him. But even as blood was spilled in the shadows of Seoul's underworld, Tae-Min's mind stayed fixed on one singular goal, the American Trade Summit in Atlanta. His investigators had finally uncovered a fragile lead, an old visa record from 20 years prior, listing a family named Blakemore, who had lived in Incheon during the exact time frame he remembered. It wasn't confirmation, it wasn't even certainty, but it was the closest he had come in 20 years, and Kim Tae-Min did not believe in coincidences. He believed in fate colliding with preparation. "Change my schedule," he told Daesung one evening, staring at the report with an intensity that unsettled even his most loyal enforcer. "Sir, the board typically sends regional executives for these logistics discussions. Your presence could raise unnecessary questions, especially with everything happening back home." "I don't care," Tae-Min said, closing the file. "I've waited 20 years for a lead this solid. I'm not sending someone else to chase it for me." The night before the summit, Sharon sat in her hotel suite in downtown Atlanta, reviewing contract terms with Monique, when a strange, unshakable feeling crept over her, the same restless unease she used to feel as a little girl standing in that alley, waiting to see if help would arrive in time. "You okay?" Monique asked, noticing Sharon staring blankly at the same paragraph for almost a full minute. "Yeah," Sharon said, shaking her head. "Just déjà vu, I guess." The next morning, the summit hall buzzed with quiet, professional energy, handshakes, translators, assistants weaving between international delegations. Sharon stood near the front of the room, reviewing her opening notes, when the doors opened and a tall, sharply dressed Korean man entered, flanked by 2 security aides. The room's energy shifted instantly, executives straightening, murmurs rippling through the crowd. "That's him," Monique said. "Kim Tae-Min, CEO of Kim Global Holdings." Sharon looked up, casually at first, professionally, the way she looked at every new business partner. But the moment her eyes met his across the room, something inside her chest seized violently, like a memory clawing its way to the surface after 20 years buried beneath adulthood, ambition, and time. Tae-Min froze mid-step. It was her. It had to be her. The eyes, the same fearless, fierce eyes that had looked down at him in the rain and refused to let him die. "Sharon," he said quietly, almost involuntarily, his English accented but clear. Her breath caught. No one had called her that with that particular hesitant hope in 20 years, except one person, in one alley, in one lifetime she thought had ended the day her aunt threw him out into the rain. "Oh my God," she whispered, her folder slipping from her fingers, papers scattering across the polished floor. "It's you! It's actually you!" The room around them blurred into irrelevance. The delegates, the translators, the multi-million-dollar contracts waiting to be signed. None of it mattered as Tae-Min crossed the room in long, urgent strides, stopping just short of her, searching her face as if confirming a memory he'd carried like a lifeline for 2 decades. "You're alive," she said, her tears rising unexpectedly in her eyes. "I looked for you. I hired people. I never stopped thinking about you." "I never stopped either," Tae-Min said, his voice rough with an emotion his empire had never once witnessed from him. 20 years, Sharon. 20 years, and I searched every version of your name I could find." If this moment just gave you chills, let me know in the comments with one word that describes how you're feeling right now, because we are far from finished. Smash that like button before we continue. This story still has one more storm to weather before its happy ending. That storm arrived 3 days later. Park Joon-ho, the rival syndicate leader back in Seoul, discovered Tae-Min's personal trip to Atlanta and, sensing an opportunity, orchestrated a plan to eliminate him permanently while he was away from the protection of his home territory. Using a corrupted contact within Tae-Min's security detail, Joon-ho arranged for armed men to intercept Tae-Min's convoy on the way back from a private dinner with Sharon, where the two had spent hours reconnecting, laughing, crying, and rebuilding 20 years of distance in a matter of hours. The attack came just outside Sharon's own corporate building, where Tae-Min had insisted on personally escorting her home, an old habit of protectiveness reborn the instant he'd found her again. Gunfire shattered the quiet street. Sharon's driver was struck in the shoulder. Chaos erupted as Tae-Min shoved Sharon behind a concrete barrier, shielding her body with his own despite his security team scrambling into position. "Stay down," he shouted, his voice raw with an urgency far more personal than professional. "Tae-Min, they're going to kill you," Sharon screamed over the gunfire, gripping his arm. "Not before I get you somewhere safe." Daesung and the remaining security detail returned fire, neutralizing 2 attackers before the rest fled into a waiting vehicle. When the gunfire finally ceased, Tae-Min remained crouched over Sharon, breathing hard, blood trickling from a graze wound along his forearm, his eyes scanning every shadow for further threats. "You're hurt," Sharon whispered, her hands shaking as she reached for his arm. "It's nothing," he said. "I've survived worse." "That's not comforting," she snapped, though tears streaked her face. "You can't keep almost dying, Tae-Min, not after I just got you back." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the woman she had become, powerful, unshaken, fiercely protective, exactly the same girl who had once dragged a dying boy out of the rain without a single thought for her own safety. "I promised you I'd find you," he said quietly. "I never once considered that promise would cost me anything. It was worth every risk." The following days moved with the intensity of a controlled war. Tae-Min flew in additional security, coordinated with international law enforcement contacts to trace the attack back to Junho's network, and worked alongside Sharon's own corporate security team, whose intelligence connections through years of logistics work proved surprisingly valuable. Sharon, refusing to sit back and simply be protected, used her own resources to help track financial transactions linking Junho's shell companies to the attempted hit, providing crucial evidence that allowed South Korean authorities, quietly pressured by Tae-Min's political allies, to move against Junho's entire operation within the week. Junho was arrested during a raid on his primary warehouse compound outside Incheon, the very same city where Tae-Min had once nearly died in an alley 20 years earlier. The irony was not lost on Tae-Min when Daesung delivered the news. "It's over, sir. Junho's organization is finished. The rest of his allies have already surrendered territory rather than face prosecution." Tae-Min exhaled a breath he felt he'd been holding for years, not just days, but years, the accumulated weight of constant threats, constant vigilance, constant emptiness disguised as ambition. "Good," he said simply. Then, for the first time in longer than he can remember, he allowed himself to smile. 3 months later, Sharon stood on the rooftop terrace of Tae-Min's Seoul headquarters. The city sprawled beneath them in glittering lights, a sharp and beautiful contrast to the desperate darkness of the alley where their story had begun. Their 2 companies had since formalized one of the largest Trans-Pacific logistics partnerships in a decade, but neither of them cared much about the business headlines anymore. "Do you remember," Sharon said softly, leaning against the railing beside him, "when you told me I talked too much?" Tae-Min chuckled, a rare, easy sound. "You still do. And you still don't say enough," she teased, nudging his shoulder. He turned to her then, his expression softening into something unguarded, something only she had ever been able to draw out of him. "There's something I never got to say to you 20 years ago, before my father found me. I was too weak to say it back then." "What?" "Gomawo," he said quietly. "Thank you for not walking past me in the rain." Her eyes glistened, memories of that terrified, starving boy flooding back alongside every year of longing that had followed. "I could never have walked past you. Something in me knew you mattered before I even understood why." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. His hands that had built empires, survived assassination attempts, and commanded fear across an entire underworld, trembling now with a vulnerability far more terrifying to him than any gunfight. "I built everything I have chasing ghosts of a promise I made in an alley, but nothing I built ever meant anything until I found the person that promise was made to. Sharon Blackmore, will you let me spend the rest of my life keeping every promise I ever made you, starting with this one?" Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion closing her throat, finally whispering the only words that mattered. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Below them, Seoul glittered on, indifferent to the two lives that had finally, after 20 long years of separation, danger, ambition, and hope, found their way back to where they always belonged, together. If this story moved you even a little, make sure to like this video, drop a comment sharing your favorite part, and subscribe for more stories just like this one, because somewhere out there, another impossible reunion is waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss it when we bring it to you next.